Hello, guys. It's DJ Morris here. How cringe is that? This is the second video lesson. By now, you should have completed lesson one, which was on minimalism. If you haven't, please go back and do that, as it is important that you follow the lessons in order, unless this is you're using this for a revision closer to the exam. Okay, so as in the last video, we're going to start with a listening question. And so you need to make sure that you've got the Audio Mac playlist and the Edmodo quiz open. Both are called Lesson 2 Impressionism. So I've put the questions up here for your reference. But as before, pause the video now and use track 1 on the Audio Mac playlist and answer questions 1 to 5 on Edmodo. So pause it now. I'm assuming that you paused the video and you completed the quiz. I'm not going to go through everything now. I do hope, however, you identified that the piece was from Latin America and that the main melody instrument used was the panpipes. If not, then you do need to go back to our notes on Latin American music and make sure you go through all the key content that we covered. Okay. Moving on to the world of Impressionism, one of the many other isms of 20th century music. We've already looked at minimalism. So we're going to focus on this style of music in this lesson. And the first task, I want you to actually listen to another piece of music. So you need to go back to the Audio Mac playlist and listen to track 2. And ideally, it would be good if you could get some responses down to the words on this slide. For example, let's see if this will work. I've not actually used it's not charged, that's why, oops. Thinking about, for example, the purpose. Oh, well, that looks good, doesn't it? And what image does this piece of music create? What kind of mood do you think it's trying to create? That kind of thing. I'm not going to be checking your answers here, but it would be useful, particularly for this style of music. So if you could pause this video now and listen to track 2 on the playlist in order to do this task. Now, I hope you did give that a go, and if not, please, can you imagine my disappointed face right now? If that's not enough to emotionally blackmail you into going back and doing the task, I don't know what is. Anyway, some of the words that you may have come up with could be something along the lines of dreamy, hypnotic, relaxed, spacey, calm, floaty, etc. If not, then no problem, because this is pretty subjective. Although in this case, it's quite important to this particular music. But again, I won't judge you if you've said something absolutely crazy. So obviously, we are dealing with Impressionism here. And so a couple of questions I want you to consider as we go through the content of this lesson and listen to some examples are: what image does the piece create? And how is this musically different to music of the Baroque, classical, or Romantic traditions? Again, we're at a point where we've covered quite a lot of content in terms of music history and around the world, and you've got to be able to differentiate it. There are obviously lots of similarities. For example, being in a major key or a minor key, that might come across, that might happen in a lot of music, but you've got to be able to distinguish the style and the period. So the piece that you've listened to has got this fancy French name. I won't embarrass myself, but the English name that we give this piece is Girl with the Flaxen Hair. It's composed by a guy called Debussy, who is arguably the most famous composer of this style of music, known as Impressionism. He did write in other styles, but a lot of his music, a lot of his most popular works are Impressionist. This piece was actually inspired by a poem, and the music itself is simply trying to create that impression. Clue is in the name, right? So the beautiful young girl sitting peacefully on the grass in the summer sunshine. Lovely. So, by the way, that's Debussy, looking really chilled there, I guess. I don't know, quite French. So here we've got the poem, and I'm going to imagine that you're going to pause the video and do a dramatic reading for your mum or dad. That's not a required task, but it might be fun. it would be good to have a look at this poem, but what I want you to do is go back and actually have a listen to the piece of music again, and then answer the question, which is, why is Impressionism a good label to give this piece? That's actually on Edmodo, question 6. So I do want you to get your answers down, and I'll be checking through once you have submitted. So pause, and again, go back to track 2 and answer that question on Edmodo. Okay, so we know this is an example of Impressionism, but what does that actually mean? I always think of a very lazy, sort of washy gesture, whether that's in music or in art. So things don't need to be overly crisp and precise and robotic. On a cynical level, you might think of really cheesy romantic films, or maybe the piano piece played by that vampire guy in Twilight. I know, I'm so down with the kids. Some key things. It's a style that developed in France in the early years of the 20th century. And again, we get commonalities across the art. So in the music, in literature, and in visual art as well. It is quite useful to actually look at some visual representations of Impressionism. You may be familiar with these works by Degas, Monet, and Renoir. Here they are, and you can see they all have this very sort of washy, blurry feel to them. To be honest, it's how the world looks to me when I don't wear my contact lenses or my glasses. To be honest, that could be a bunch of Vespucci students wearing fancy hats, but maybe not. But similarly, in the music, there are musical devices which are used to create these similar effects. The melodies are often quite long and quite flowing, and actually relatively chromatic as well, rather than being in clean, balanced phrases. Rhythms equally are quite fluid and complex to give the feeling of movement. So, like, for example, water is a theme that comes up a lot in Impressionism. So we're going to go on to another piece, focusing on music again. And I want you to listen to track 3 and think about these 2 questions. What do you notice about the direction of the line? So I'm thinking about the contour, the shape of the music. And then what do you notice specifically about the shape of the chords themselves? So pause the video again, and you're going to listen to track 3 on the Audio Mac playlist. Okay, so when we think about chords, we often think about chord shapes. Think about the intervals used in the chords. They stay the same. It's just the notes that go higher. We have a look at these shapes here. I want you to think about the shape that we've got. Now, again, you could go back and have a listen, otherwise continue. The shape we're dealing with here is a parallelogram. That's exactly what we've got in the music. I've got the first bar of music. This is track 3. And if you look at the chords, in either the right or left hand, actually, you should notice that they are moving up with the same intervals, essentially. This is called parallel motion, or we sometimes call them parallel chords. And so this is a really key feature of Impressionism, something to get down in your notes. Another thing is the use of modes. We've spoken a few times about the idea of modes and how they're different from just the major and minor keys signatures that we're used to using. Now, the modes have been around for a long time. We often talk about what are called the medieval modes. And these came back into fashion in the 20th century. And essentially, it's a different type of scale which uses a different combination of tones and semitones. So if you think about the major scale formula, you start on your root note, and then you've got tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So actually, you could make all sorts of interesting and different combinations of those things. And that's actually where you get these different modes. So composers started to use modes again instead of just writing a piece in a major key or a minor key. Obviously, on the other side of that, we get composers writing 12-tone music as well, but that's not something that we tend to associate with Impressionism. Now, thinking about this idea of modes, what I want you to do is actually have a look at the first bar of music here. So we've got something that's moving, you could argue, in a sort of parallel motion. It's moving in thirds, but I want you to take the top line and I want you to work out from the top note, which is a G sharp, to the note that I've finished the circle on, the C natural in the second bar. What is the interval between each of those notes? So if you pause the video and just work that out. Hopefully, I'm speaking slowly, hopefully you've done that. You've paused the video and you've worked out that between each of these notes, we've actually got the same interval. And just to kind of demonstrate that, let's see if I can, oh wait, yeah, I keep forgetting my pen isn't working. But for example, from the G sharp down to an F sharp, that looks so bad, sorry. That is a whole tone, or a tone, or a major second. I'm not going to circle anymore because it's just going to look really messy. But from the F sharp down to the E, we've got a major second. From an E down to a D, we've got a major second. And from a D down to a C, we've got a major second. Okay, so each note is moving by a major second or a tone. And this is an example of what we call a whole tone scale. And this is absolutely crucial to this kind of music again, to Impressionism. It's super stereotypical, and I always think of it in sort of like dream sequences and flashbacks and that kind of thing. But it's highly effective, and we often do hear it in music by Debussy particularly. It's not to say that all Impressionist music uses whole tone scales, but it is good to know. Another thing that's good to know is that Debussy was actually heavily influenced by music from other cultures, which, if you think about it, in late 19th century, early 20th century, that's quite radical, really. Debussy had the opportunity to hear music from other cultures in quite a famous sort of fair of visiting and travelling music. And he was particularly influenced by Indonesian gamelan music through its use of ostinatos and the hypnotic effect created by the music. Another thing that he observed was the use of the pentatonic scale. And so again, you get these things a lot in Impressionism. Whilst I've just mentioned the whole tone scale as being a key feature, we often get the pentatonic scale as well. Okay, it's time to test that you've actually been paying attention. So I want you to pause the video and simply answer question 7 on the Edmodo quiz. It's only one question, but read it carefully. Okay, assuming that you've answered question 7, we're going to move on. And this is, again, absolutely essential that you have this information. So these are some of the key features of Impressionism. We've already talked about this idea of parallel motion, parallel chords, and we've talked about the use of the whole tone scale. But also some other things to get down are listed here. Looking at this list, I don't think there's anything that's particularly confusing. Just maybe something to note is this idea of irregular phrase length. So quite often we've talked about balanced phrases, particularly in classical music. So you might have a 4-bar question phrase and you might have a 4-bar answer phrase. Here we're talking about having phrases of different lengths, so it doesn't have to be balanced and symmetrical. Anyway, if you haven't done so already, press pause and get these things down. And just to finish off, what I want you to do now is answer an actual exam question, just like before, like the previous lesson. You need to answer questions 8 to 12 on Edmodo, and it's track 4 on the Audio Mac playlist. Again, I suggest listening no more than 3 times and give yourself a pause in between. And once you're done, if you submit the quiz, that will send everything from this lesson to me. If you have any questions, let me know. But I do recommend doing a bit more listening Just Google Debussy and you'll come up with all sorts of wonderful pieces. As lots of you are actually pianists in the class, I do recommend also that you have a go at playing some of his pieces, particularly the preludes. They're really cool, really interesting to play. Okay, that's all for today.